Good evening to you, my friends. My name is Joseph Dudley. I was born in 1822 and lived in the red house that stands just outside these gates, on the other side of Wallingford Road, beside that building once marked Norm's Barber Shop. I lived there with my parents, Elias and Laura Dudley, with 3 brothers and 3 sisters. I stand here now beside my brother George's grave marker, which I carved for him. Our father was a master marble worker. Brother George and I were his apprentices. We were frequently commissioned to carve headstones, and there's many examples of our work here in this cemetery. Right down the path, you'll see an example as you walk by. Look down at the bottom, you'll see our names carved there as evidence of our craftsmanship. My 2 youngest brothers did not follow in our father's footsteps. Brother Samuel was a respected clerk for John Foote. Brother Samuel was a successful carriage manufacturer in New Haven. But it was in more ways than occupation that my brothers failed to follow in our father's footsteps. But I'm getting ahead of my story. Let me go back a bit. Our father was a staunch Methodist, and as such believed in the assurance of salvation if one lived a life of Christian mission, guided by the method, with devotion to biblical study and prayer and helping the underprivileged. As evidence of his faith, he led our family in prayer 3 times a day, preaching at length against slavery and in support of the temperance movement. In the mid-1830s, as Father approached middle age, he became increasingly alarmed by how the world of sin and temptation were so astray from God's will. He began to suspect that the end of our world and the second coming of Christ would soon be upon us. Well, you may smile at this belief now, but imagine if you had lived in a time of great social upheaval, divisiveness, increased violence, rampant immorality. Well, you might conclude likewise. Father was not alone in his belief that the judgment day was nigh. It was a common view held at the time, known as the Advent movement. A prominent voice in this movement was that of a biblical scholar and a Baptist lay minister from upstate New York, Reverend William Miller. Reverend Miller believed that the timing of the second coming of Christ was encoded in the prophecies of Daniel, which naturally he had deciphered. And according to his calculations, our world would end in the year 1843. He published his findings and began lecturing widely. Over the years, he attracted a number of followers, known as the Millerites. In this way, he had created a movement within a movement, the Millerite Adventist movement. Father was drawn to Reverend Miller's teachings, and after studying his research, he became a Millerite himself, as did the rest of the family. Father kept a watchful eye in the year 1843, but, well, the world did not end. A short while later, though, several of Reverend Miller's associates revisited the clues and revised the prediction, this time with more precision. Our world would come to an end on October 22nd, 1844. Father began to make preparations. When the fateful day in 1844 arrived, my parents and the 7 of us children were gathered together in our home, wearing our white ascension robes. Suitable for heaven. I was the oldest, at 22. When the sun began dropping in the sky, Father could not hold back his excitement and joy. He went outside and actually climbed a tall nearby tree. Well, we understood. When the trumpets sounded and all souls, living and dead, were called to the Lord's house, he would be 15 feet closer and have the clearest view of the heavenly kingdom. Back in the house, the rest of us sat together through the night, nodding off upright in chairs, while outside Father grasped the branch of that tree with confidence, with joyous anticipation. That slowly turned to dwindling hope, and then to deep disappointment. When the sun rose the next morning, Father came down from his perch in the tree, silent, dejected. We all dispersed. We were left to our own thoughts about what had occurred, what had not occurred. What did it all mean? To the Adventists and the Millerites in particular, the failed prophecy meant a period of spiritual questioning for its members, set against a tide of public ridicule and harassment. Many followers left the fold during this time. Though the Advent movement survived, belief in the imminence of Advent was restated. However, a future date for Christ's return was not set. The Adventists called this period the Great Disappointment, which, well describes its impact on my family. You see, when Father came down from his tree, the natural strength seemed to leave his body. He was sick with disappointment. He lay prostrate in his bedchambers for 2 days. After a time, pulled by responsibility and by the realization that humanity cannot calculate the will of God, he roused himself from bed and resumed his life. Lucky were we that Mother had prevented him from giving away all of our family's earthly possessions beforehand, as others had done. He resumed his life and recommitted to living his Methodist principles, leading our family in prayer 3 times a day. And he remained active in the Advent movement. Brother George and I, as the 2 eldest sons, knew it was our duty to follow in our father's footsteps and keep the events of October 22nd, 1844 behind us. We continued to work with our father, share in his faith, and like him, remained active with the Advent movement. The same could not be said for the rest of my brothers and sisters, all of whom remained faithful Christians, but as they grew into adulthood, they disengaged from the Advent movement. Whether from profound disappointment or disillusionment, I am not sure. We never talked about that day. But I am sure Father felt their separation from his faith as a separation from himself, adding a layer of disappointment and, in the end, brokering a distance in those relationships, as I alluded to earlier. Father bore his disappointments by leaning on his deep faith. For the rest of his life, he maintained that he was living in the end times, and his hope that he would live to witness Christ's return. But obviously this was not to be. When he died 7 years later, he had to leave his earthly body behind. But we have no doubt his soul ascended to heaven and met Jesus there. As for my dear brother George, he followed my father to the sweet beyond quite unexpectedly, just 2 years later, ushered in by the typhus fever. First a rash, chills, fever, delirium, and with that he was gone. I had taken over the family business, and so I carved this headstone for him. On the back I inscribed, "Sleep on, dear George, the time is short. The grave can't keep thee long. Thou willst arise and then depart and join the blood-washed throne." Time is short. And so, before I bid you farewell, I will ask of you this small favor. Later tonight, when you're thinking of the story of my father, or sharing it with a friend, and a smile of ridicule comes to your face as you're thinking of my father, wearing a white robe, up in a tree, waiting for his Savior, remember this. My father waited with joyous anticipation as he had spent his whole life serving the underprivileged and spreading the knowledge of salvation to others. How many of those gathered here tonight can say they know such a feeling? Go with God, and we might see each other again someday.